All right, we are back here in 2015. And ironically enough, not only is it a new year in the Gregorian calendar, but we're also going to be working on a new book. Exodus, exactly. Yeah, we're not changing from Torah to something else, but we are in the new book, which is Exodus. And remember, historically in antiquity, the different books of the Torah, not in the sanctuary, but in general study, would have been written on separate scrolls. Because as you know, trying to roll through an entire 5-book takes a long time. And if you're only going to be studying rather than actually reading liturgically, it's much more convenient to have just a one roll. So we're on a second book, not just a second section. And that means we're going to introduce ourselves to the character who will dominate the whole rest of the Torah. We talked a lot about the characters in Bereshit, but now who's the man? Moses.
Oh, very good.
How early on do we know Moses is special?
From the first. When he's put in the basket.
When he's put in the basket? From the first? Well, before he's born? After he's born?
No.
Is there anything special about his childhood? Do we know anything about his childhood?
Yeah. He's a Jewish boy raised in the palace in Egypt.
So he's a Jewish boy raised in the palace. Is he a Jewish boy knows he's a Jewish boy raised in the palace? Is he raised as an Egyptian then discovers later? Is there a mixture of his? What do we know about him, both from his birth as well as the early stages of his childhood? And the answer is about that much.
But his mother was his nanny. How much did she reveal to him?
His mother was his
wet nurse.
Right, his wet nurse, which is slightly different than his nanny, as we're going to see. So thankfully, our sages said, you know what, there's more here than just that much. So we're going to be looking through at some of the earlier midrashim about Moses and what made him special. There are a lot of other very famous midrashim. Most of you probably have heard the story about Moses putting on the crown of Pharaoh and then the test with putting coal in his mouth, and that's why he stuttered from burning his tongue. We're not going to look at that one today, but I just had to say it now because you know it's obligatory when talking about Moses as a kid. So instead, we're going to look at first the Torah about his birth, and then we're going to look at some of the other midrashim about his birth and very, very early childhood, and try and figure out what in the world is going on with this guy and why did the rabbis waste their time coming up with these fairy tales? Notice all the air quotes. Because as we know, our sages didn't just believe in wasting time and making stuff up for no reason or just to entertain the children. They may have done that. Who knows what sort of stories they told their kids for bedtime. That's not what they wrote down in the Talmud and other sources in Midrashim. So we are on page 321. We're going to begin with chapter 2 of the book of Exodus because that's where Moses comes into to play. And as usual, I need a volunteer that I can interrupt.
May I volunteer?
Harriet, please.
Thank you so much. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman.
What a surprise.
The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months.
All right, any questions there?
Yeah.
What?
Why would she have to hide him?
So, why hide?
Well, my grandchildren were the most beautiful I've ever seen, and I didn't hide them.
And you thought your children were beautiful. So why is she hiding them? We have a basic answer to this one,
Yes.
which we kind of missed because of chapter 1.
Right.
Because the firstborn Jewish boys were being killed.
Not
No.
technically the firstborn.
No.
Any born Jewish boys were being chucked into the river, right? So why hide was because of that whole river thing. But then what do we make of the rest of that sentence? Because does it say that she saw that they were throwing babies in the river, so she hid him?
No, because it seems to say there's a reason why she did it, and that's because he was beautiful.
Beautiful. Why are we talking about Moses being beautiful? And is it actually the word beautiful in the Hebrew?
Oh, that's a good question.
Right. Now, the word that's actually used is
He was good.
tov, right? Tov. Tov, which usually most of us would translate as good. What does it mean for a baby to be good? Now, I'm not asking for an answer right now, but that's something we got to keep in our mind. But also, what is the relationship between these two parts of that sentence? We would have expected, because Pharaoh was killing babies, she hid him.
Yeah.
which would have made a lot more sense. But instead, because he was beautiful, she hit him. Because he was good, she hit him. Because he was goodly, as some of the older translations will render it, she hit him. It gets a little bit more confusing. Onward.
When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile.
All right, so apology to all filmmakers ever. She did not put the basket in the river floating down the river, right? I know that's how everybody does it. And Mel Brooks, by the way, does it beautifully with the two competing baskets, if you haven't seen that. But you guys haven't seen that clip with the two?
No.
Oh, you got to go back and watch it. But she doesn't just drop him in the river and say, all right, let's see what happens. She's very, very deliberate about this and is fulfilling Pharaoh's law by the letter of the law. She has put her kid in the river. Never said he couldn't be in a basket, right? That's why Jews became good lawyers. And then we see what happens.
And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him.
Right, what's going to happen to the kid?
The daughter of Pharaoh came down to the Nile to bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy, crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child."
All right, so we'll pause there. So questions? All very straightforward? Yeah, JPS did a really good job of translating this so smoothly that nothing seems out of place. But there are a few things that are a little just bumpy, right, with the way the language. I know sometimes we automatically correct the language mentally from clunky translations, and then we think that we're somehow helping. But oftentimes we need to recognize that the Hebrew is a little bit uneven, which is trying to tell us, or at least get us to ask something. So, for example, when she opened it, she saw it was a child, a boy crying. Why the repetition? Why the switch between child and boy? Right. The first part of that word is a yeled. First part of that sentence is the word yeled. The second part, the one that's crying, is a na'ar. Now, na'ar usually means
Young boy.
a young boy. Yeah, young boys can be fools. But that's a more derivative usage of the word. But na'ar is, you normally would expect a lad to be called a na'ar. So why does it say that? And why is he crying now? Was he not crying before she opened it? Why is she taking pity on it now? Is she taking pity on him because he's crying? Because he's a na'ar? Because he's a Hebrew?
Is yeled a term that could be either masculine or feminine?
No.
It has to be masculine.
Yeled is definitely.
So once you say yeled, or you say na'ar, we know we mean a boy, not a girl floating who accidentally got there.
Absolutely.
Because she would know that the boys were going to be killed by her father.
Presuming she knew her father's laws, exactly right.
Right.
And
but if it's either way, it's a boy, then I don't.
But either way, it's a boy, right? In English, we get that lovely ambiguity. She saw it was a child, a boy. That makes perfect sense in English. But if you say she saw that it was a boy baby or a boy child, it was a boy crying.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden there's this sort of odd redundancy, especially when the second word that's used is typically used to describe a much older child rather than an infant. So it's clunky and it demands some explanation. And so she has moved for pity. She's moved to pity the child. And so now?
Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes."
Right, you got a baby. You didn't give birth to it. The child needs to eat. Right? And women don't just always produce what's necessary for children to eat. So
I think there's a question we might have passed over. You should excuse me. How did she know he was a Hebrew child?
Because he was floating in the river.
Right.
Right.
He was talking. Right.
Yeah. Yeah, because he was floating.
because he was floating, right? And
It
she's
was a blue. He was wearing a blue
Yeah.
cloth.
he had a little
Is that the
kippah,
movie?
right?
Oh, yeah, right.
Would he have been
circumcised at this time?
Well, when do we circumcise Jewish boys? 8 days. So presumably he would have been circumcised at this point.
If we had that commandment by then.
Well,
Well,
Abraham
I'm
had that
already
commandment.
Abraham had it.
Right.
That's
So even though the
right.
Torah itself had not been given, for the children of Abraham, that was already the commandment. Yes.
So there's no question she would have known that he was Hebrew.
Yes, although outside of the text of the Torah and outside of the text of our sages, we also know that circumcision wasn't uncommon among the Egyptians. So it wasn't a purely Jewish custom at this time. So it wouldn't have been the singular identifier. But circumcised boy in the river, that altogether may have been what led her to this conclusion. Maybe. So she needs a wet nurse, and Miriam just happens to pop up with a helpful hint. Where were you in the bushes near my palace? But anyway, there she is.
Right? Shall I get a nurse to suckle the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter answered, yes. So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages. So the woman took the child and nursed it.
So think about that for a while. You're getting paid to nurse your own baby.
When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, I drew him out of the water.
All right. And by the way, Moses is a perfectly good explanation relying on the Hebrew, which would be unlikely for her to name her son a obviously Hebrew name. However, Moses is a beautifully good Egyptian name, meaning son. As in Tutmosis and Ramses, Ramoses, right? All those Moses at the end of all those King Tut people things, that all is the same word as Moses. So it's a perfectly good Egyptian name with a perfectly good parallel that fits this particular kid because of the coming out of the water thing. So it's a wonderful synergy.
Also, a few observations.
Please.
One, there's no recording of anybody being surprised that there's this little girl walking around. Maybe because that happened a lot.
Mhm.
There were a lot of people. Maybe.
The river was the river, so.
Exactly. The second thought that I had was if the Jewish children, males, are being put to death, there's a lot of mothers who are nursing,
Mhm.
so it might not have been very difficult for the princess, what is she called, the queen, the princess?
The daughter of Pharaoh.
The daughter of Pharaoh, to find a Hebrew woman to do this, because there'd be a lot available.
Yes,
So-
unfortunately, yes.
So the situation is kind of interesting.
And the fact that she is looking for or willing to take a Hebrew mother is also very significant. It could be that this was clear to Pharaoh's daughter what was happening, and that she was going along with this in compassion and mercy. I mean, clearly she already knew she was taking a child that by her father's rules were supposed to die, and not letting him die. The fact that she is sort of just going along with what Miriam has suggested may also be with her awareness that what is likely to happen here is this is the mother. I mean, why else is this daughter here or this girl here? It could also be, however, that it would have been unseemly for an Egyptian woman to have suckled a Hebrew slave.
They wouldn't sit at the same table
Exactly right.
to eat dinner.
Right. So with his Hebrewness, I mean, the Pharaoh's daughter may still be saying, all right, fine, I'll raise him, but there's no way an Egyptian woman's going to consent to letting this slave child, even if it's now going to be adopted as mine, use her as the wet nurse. So it's a very complicated social and compassionate mix that's going on here. It's not that simple, even though we only have a few words. Now, we're just going to read the very, very beginning of verse 11 because it introduces us to a second redundancy that we need to explain.
Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors.
All right, so that's all we're going to do. But what happened there that was unusual? Not the kinsfolk part.
Oh, baby, he's grown up.
He's grown up.
He's grown up.
How many times has he grown up?
Twice, yeah.
Twice. right? He grew up in verse 11,
So the child grew up, yeah.
and he grew up in verse
Verse
10.
Yeah.
How many times can he grow up? I know some people who never grow up, but there seems to be a redundancy of growing here. And so that's something also that our sages are going to pick up on.
Yeah, and his mother, Yocheved, didn't have him until he grew up, I don't think.
Exactly right. So did she keep him until he grew up in terms of weaning, right? Although there is actually a Hebrew word for being weaned, just like in English. So we wouldn't have expected the phrase grow up there. But if she only had him till he grew old enough to not be weaned, or to be weaned and not have to suckle, then that's far too young to have imparted to him his identity. Because even though people would often suckle a child until they were 2 or 3 years old in the ancient world, that was still not old enough to impart to him exactly who he was and where he came from and who his people were.
So she had daily contact with him until he was a teenager?
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's why it's awkward. That's why it's cumbersome. And all of a sudden he's walking out, and immediately he has this encounter as he sees his people, meaning the Israelites, suffering under the slavery. And as he sees one in particular act of injustice, he steps up in a way that is completely counter to what he would have learned in the palace, except for the fact that his Egyptian mother also behaved in a way that was completely counter to what she would have learned in the palace, because she defied her father and saved this child in the first place. So perhaps he was following his second mother, perhaps he was following his birth mother. But whatever the case is, he is turned out to be an exceptional man, and we don't have much to tell us where that came from or why.
Isn't that true of the other greats like Abraham?
Mm-hmm.
You don't know what kind of a child he was.
He walks out of nowhere, exactly. And all of a sudden God is talking to him and saying, I'm giving you this entire country.
So this is the standard for the Torah at this time, where we don't care too much about what they're doing as a child. What we care about is when they reach adulthood and the decisions that they make.
Very true. Unlike the stories of Hercules and other Greek myths where they always have, strangling the snake in the crib and things like that, we don't get a whole lot of those. But on the other hand, we kind of want to believe that there was something happening that would presage what they were going to accomplish, what they were going to be when they were older. That it wasn't just a random maybe, that you could somehow tell there was something going on here. Maybe it's what we expect from our stories, right? Maybe?
Yeah.
Maybe? All right, well, it's certainly what was expected from our sages. And so they are going to help give us a little insight on this. All right, let's see. We just about got them all around. Everybody's already running through the list. Yes, they're short and pithy teachings, but that doesn't mean they're simple. So don't just try and zip through them like you're taking shots, right? Okay, so Harriet, if you'll go off with our first one.
And the woman conceived and bore a son.
Perfectly normal sentence that we had there, right? At the beginning of page 322, it was, what was that, verse 2, right? She conceived, she bore, that's the normal way. But what do our sages say?
The bearing is compared to the conception. Just as the conception was painless, so was the bearing.
Hooray for pain-free childbirth.
Oh.
No epidural, but the fact that it just says she conceived and bore means that the bearing was as simple as the conception, and therefore, hooray. You could tell there was something special already happening here. Now, this may seem a little odd just floating here by itself, but the rabbis use this not just as a statement of the blessing that Moses was even as he was born, that God forbid the person who would redeem our people would cause pain to his mother. But they also use this as an explanation of why she was able to hide him. And as a callback, to use like a TV type term, a callback to the discussion among the midwives, which is the Jewish women. They're strong. They don't need a midwife, right? So they give birth before I even show up. And here we see it in play. that Yocheved was able to give birth in such a way that she was not screaming and shouting and calling out, which would have alerted the Egyptians that a baby was being born. And then they would have come in and done what the Egyptians were doing with the babies. Make sense?
I didn't think you could convince me on that, but you're getting there.
Yeah, there's
something to be said for that.
There's something to be said for there, because otherwise, how in the world
Would they not know?
would they not know? If this is an entire country dedicated to killing the boys that are being born, every birth is going to be a security act, right? It's going to be, we need to send in the police because we heard a baby was born. We have to check if it was a boy or a girl. So the only way you can get past that would be to make sure that the birth itself was not as loud as births normally are without modern medication. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, and it also makes sense, again, as I said, from a more spiritual way, of the idea that God forbid Moses' entry to the world should cause pain, because he was here only to bring redemption. Okay, second one.
Next one is when she saw him that he was good.
All right, we're going to work with this for a while. Because as we already saw in our initial discussion here, what does it mean that he was tov? What JPS translates that as beautifully, but what does it mean that he was good from having just been born, and that somehow that has some connection to what happened later? So first example.
Okay, first example from the Tannites. Rabbi Meir says his name was good.
She called him tov. That was his name.
Rabbi Judah says his name was the Lord is good.
Right? Tobias or Tobiah and in English, right? You know, tov plus Yah, right? That God is good.
Oh. Rabbi Nehemiah says.
Now, you should note, by the way,
Yeah.
both of these statements, what do they have to say about Moses' character?
Nothing, just
Nothing.
his name.
It's just his name.
Just his name.
Right? That this odd phrase about ki tohu was just a naming sentence. That's all. Because after all, who gives him a name according to the rest of the story?
The princess.
The princess,
Princess.
right? Bat Paro, right? The daughter of Pharaoh named him. Are we to believe that our Redeemer has no Hebrew name? That his name is only the name given to him by an Egyptian?
His name is Tov.
His name is Tov, right? Why not? So the rabbis found a Hebrew name for him.
Where does Moshe come from?
Moshe, according to the Torah, is coming from an Egyptian statement based upon a Hebrew word, which gets real blurry. But
Grammatically, it's a mess.
yeah, exactly. It kind of sort of maybe can be plausible to work. But the most likely explanation is simply that he was named son, like every other Egyptian boy would have been named son, with the word Moses, you know, as being a good Egyptian. But obviously, we did not want to only give him an Egyptian name, so the Torah already gave him a Hebrew derivation for the Egyptian name. And here the rabbis, who probably would have also known the Egyptian Moses, meaning son, say, we can do one better and give him a real Hebrew name. And one that his own mother gave him rather than his adoptive mother.
And then after good and the Lord is good, Rabbi Nehemiah says he was worthy of prophecy.
Right? That's what good means, is that she could tell just by looking at him, this boy is going to be worthy of prophecy. All mothers think that, right? Okay, maybe we're not so big on Rabbi Nehemiah, but
And others say he was born circumcised.
that's what she meant when she said he's good, right? Because she gave birth to him, cut the umbilical cord, took a look and said, he's circumcised already, which is possible, to be born without a foreskin, and therefore he is good. Seen some notes? Yeah, maybe. Right?
Maybe he was born, he didn't cry when he came out so nobody would hear him.
And as most new parents will tell you about their newborns,
They cry.
if they're not crying, they're such a good baby.
Right.
Does he keep you up at night? No, he's such a good baby.
Good, that's right.
Right, so maybe she meant Tov in the way that most new parents mean Tov, which was 3 months she was able to hide this kid because he wasn't making too much noise, which again, people would have been on the lookout for the sound of babies crying. Okay, but let's go back to the circumcision thing.
Okay.
So A little bit from another midrash source.
Another midrash says Moses too was born circumcised.
In Avot the Rabbi Natan, there's a whole list of our people that were born circumcised, and Moses is in that list. And you're welcome to look up the full list in your free time.
For it is said, and she saw him that he was good. What did his mother see that made him better and more magnificent than all other human beings?
Right, because as all mothers know, when you look into the eyes of your child, of course you think your child is good. So why would the Torah record that she saw that he was good unless there was something exceptional that made him gooder than all the other ones? And what would that be?
Only that he was born circumcised.
Exactly. So that was what would have been remarkable. Because yes, every parent says their baby's good. Every parent says when their baby is quiet that they're good. The Torah wouldn't record something that was so commonplace, is what the sages are saying here. Therefore, what would have been exceptionally good in the eyes of a mother, that he was born pre-circumcised.
What if the mother's name is
Yocheved?
Yocheved?
Yes.
It's not unusual at this period for lots of people to have the gift of prophecy. And maybe this name, even if it's a description and not a proper name, but even if it's a proper name, is referring to something she knows.
So maybe there is a level to her declaration of good that goes beyond the physical, right? It's not just that she's naming him in the normal way that we name people. It's not just that he was already circumcised, which makes him special compared to most boys. That she sees something here that is especially good, and knowing that this is going to have an impact on the world that is beyond what most parents believe the impact of their child will be on the world. That there is a touch of prophecy in her statement here. And indeed, that's going to bring us to our next quote.
And sages say, when Moses was born, the whole house was filled with light.
Now that would be a giveaway, right? I mean, you think your baby's special, did your baby make the whole house glow?
Oh.
And if the baby's making the whole house glow, then obviously mom's going to say, this kid's good. There is something exceptional here. Now, why would the sages have said there'd be light glowing here? Because we have a lovely little parallelism.
Here it's written, and when she saw him, she saw that he was good. And elsewhere it was written, God saw the light that it was good.
Way back in the very first chapter of Genesis, right? When God sees the light, and the light is Kitov.
Kitov.
And here, Kitov.
But wouldn't the light been kind of a giveaway?
Yes, for the Egyptian patrols, the glowing house may have been the kind of thing that would attract attention. Yes, that is definitely true.
Now, Miriam and Aaron are also very special. Are there midrashim about them being special in this kind of way?
Not in regards to their birth. There are other midrashim about the specialness of Miriam and Aaron, but not in regard to their birth. Moses is the only one who gets these sort of birth stories.
So do the sages think that the only reason Miriam and Aaron are special is because Moses was their brother?
No, I mean, they both were considered prophets in their own right, and they both
But
were...
only because of Moses?
It doesn't say that God made them prophets because of Moses, and it doesn't even say that Aaron became the high priest because of Moses. It just says that they were prophets and were also selected for very important duties.
And Miriam with the well that whole line of midrashim might speak more to her leadership than to the fact that she's somebody's sister.
So it is a little, it's easy to think that that was a form of like nepotism, of divine favoritism. If, okay, Moses, you want me to give a job to your sister and brother too? We can do that, sure. The company's big enough. We can fit them in the budget. But we don't see God doing that anywhere else, where because I like you, I'm also going to give your brother a job. So most of the sages and the text itself seems to just feel that Aaron and Miriam were special in their own right. Not make the house glow special, but were special in their own right.
Rabbi Nathanael says, Moses' father saw his visage was like an
sorry.
angel of God.
That should be an and, not an and.
Yeah, an angel of God.
Exactly. So according to Shemot Rabbah, when his father, who hasn't really been mentioned yet since that whole went out and got the wife pregnant thing, sees the kid and says, this kid looks like an angel. And from the other midrashim, it seems to be implying more than just my son's an angel in the standard parental discussion, but there was something about the face of Moses that shone in a way that made him think of God's angels. Now, this is, of course, rather heavy-handed foreshadowing to what comes later, because what do we know about Moses and light and glowing face and all of that?
Business with the
Right.
A business with the rays of light, right? With what eventually gets mistranslated as horns. And thank you, Michelangelo, for the beautiful statue and the horns, which if you've never looked up the picture of Michelangelo's Moses of the statue in the Vatican, it is definitely worth seeing in person. And if you can't see it in person, definitely see some photos because it is gorgeous artwork, except for the horns.
I thought it's because part of it has to do with the word Karen.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. No, it's not part of it. It's exactly because
That's
of.
what the problem
It's
is.
exactly because of the word, which can be used to mean light rays and can be used to mean horns. And I guess he picked the one that was easier to sculpt. Now, he picked the one that was in vogue of the translation at the time in his community.
But
So
Moses was like an angel of God because he got to speak with God, punny face to face.
exactly. So we're seeing here references to what Moses will become in his birth itself. And references to the idea that light will be associated with his face, the idea that he will stand amongst the angels, the idea that he will shine with the light is all being put right up here at the beginning, according to these midrashim. And that is the reason why the special efforts were taken with regards to hiding and saving him. Because remember, that was our question, was how does the beautiful impact her decision to hide him for 3 months? Right? Why didn't she just go through with Pharaoh's edict? Because presumably the other mothers did. You know, there was an understanding that the Pharaoh's soldiers were going to kill the boys. And more to the point, they would kill them if you didn't. So why bother hiding him? But if there was something special about him, because he was Tov, then now we know why she was struggling trying to keep him hidden for 3 months.
But do you really believe that? I mean, if there are thousands of baby boys being born, don't you think there are going to be thousands of mothers who say, instead of killing the boy, let's give him a small chance of living? And
The rivers were clogged with baskets.
Yeah,
wouldn't you think? Wouldn't every mother do that?
Yes and no.
These are mothers who are slaves.
Right.
They're not used to acting on their own anyway. They follow orders.
And not just that, but if you go back to our very first midrash, which was trying to put things in place for us, if the Egyptians knew you were pregnant, and they would have seen that you were pregnant, there would have been an expectation of, where's the kid? Show us the kid, and we will now dispose of us. Now, according to the midrash, Moses was born on the 7th of Adar. And if you do the math based upon another midrash, which says that he was born 3 months early, which was why she was able to get away with this, then it actually works out that he would have been put into the river on the day of Shavuot. We're good at math in Judaism, right? Well, I'm good at remembering the math that other people have done. I'm not so good at working it out myself. But the idea would then be that he was put into the river on the day that many, many years later, well, about 80, we would receive the Torah. Just chew on that for a while. And that would explain the 3-month gap, because they weren't looking for a boy because they thought she was still pregnant. And hence the bearing and being painless becomes even more important and perhaps even more understandable if he was 3 months early, which even nowadays is very difficult for a child to survive. Back then, it would have made the birth much less physically strenuous, but much less likely the child would live. And yet he did. And she knew, therefore, there was something extra special, and she had a chance to get this kid away before the authorities came looking. All right, onward.
And the boy grew.
Remember, this was our double growing.
She suckled him for 24 months, and yet you say he grew up? This teaches that he did not grow in the manner of the rest of the world.
Right. So the Torah says he grew, but it was only weaning. I mean, it was just suckling. So why use the word grow rather than the word wean? Because he grew to full size in 24 months.
Sure.
Right? He was a grown up. Yeah, not looking like a lot of support for this here. Right? We're okay with kind of sort of glowing. We're okay with kind of sort of being special from birth, and these other midrashim are working okay. But the idea of growing up to full size in a year or 2 years doesn't really, that we're not rocking that. Okay, wait for the next one. Yeah, well, it doesn't get worse. I'm not going to use that phrase when talking about our midrashim. It will stretch us further.
In connection to Og.
We all remember the giant Og, right? Who we eventually fight later on in the book of Numbers, right? Guy, big bed. That's the famous reference that's used. Who was a giant? Well,
How tall was Moses? He was 10 cubits tall.
because Moses apparently struck down Og, according to this midrash.
He took an axe 10 cubits long, jumped 10 cubits into the air, hit him on his ankle, and killed him.
All right. So can we do the math here? So a cubit is basically 1.5 feet. How tall was Moses?
15 feet.
15 foot tall, right? NBA star, no problem.
Right.
So it's a 15-foot tall guy. He jumps. Sorry, he has an axe that is how long?
15 feet.
15 feet, right? Because it's 10 cubits. So it's 15 plus 15. So now we're up to 30 feet. He jumps 10 cubits into the air. We're up to 45 feet. And he hits Og in the ankle. So how big is Og? And how big is Moses? Right? There's another midrash that says that Pharaoh was 1 cubit tall, which would make him about that big. You know, sort of a big Barbie or a big Ken doll, I guess it's. That's a Pharaoh Ken outfit. I don't know whether you can get that. You can probably get Egyptian Princess Barbie, but can you get Pharaoh Ken? I'll call Mattel and see what they're doing. But what's with the size things here? I mean, don't know. I mean, did the rabbis really think that Moses was twice the height of this room?
Well, if they really think that in 24 months he grew to the full height of a man,
Mm-hmm.
well, but he's still growing. He's only 2 years old.
Right.
Maybe they figure he just kept going.
So what does it mean to be the full height of a man at 2 years? What does it mean? Let me just rephrase that in English. What does it mean to be the full measure of a man at 2 years?
Well, it's hyperspeak. I think it's talking about maybe maturity.
Mm-hmm. Moses at 2 was where most of us would hope to be as adults. Right? Remember, we have to try and begin to understand why was Moses able to A, overcome where he grew up and all of the difficulties that entailed, and B, able to connect to God in a way that was unparalleled before or since.
I have a problem with the whole line of reasoning, because if you have a child who's truly special like
Mhm.
this, that means from the beginning he's treated by everyone else as incredibly special.
Mm-hmm.
But throughout Moses' life, he's incredibly humble. And he says to God, I'm not special. Why are you choosing me? The two don't add up. A child who grows up incredibly special,
Mm-hmm.
who's treated by the whole world as special, doesn't look at himself like he's nothing.
I could kiss you, Howie. So exactly right.
But don't do it.
I'm not going to. It's okay. It's okay. I'm all the way over here, and I'm
That's a different story.
yeah. So exactly right. He is born special. Everyone knows he's special. The Egyptians know he's special. His birth family knew he was special. He is able to reach the level that a normal man would by the time he's 2, and by the time he's truly full grown, he's 15 times or 7 times, depending on how you do the math. Again, I'm not a good mathematician. The measure of a normal person. This is not someone in our day and age who would grow up with a low self-esteem issue, right? Who would say, oh, who am I to go talk to Pharaoh? He'd say, I'll go talk to Pharaoh. I'm 15 cubits tall, and he's only 1. But that was what made Moses special. And that is what made him able to reach God, was precisely because despite his exceptional abilities, despite his exceptional stature inside, he did not view himself as deserving of the praise and the special status that was always given to him by others. He still saw himself as being a guy who could go out and, move the rock, the guy who would go out and help the sheep. That was still who he thought of himself. And it was precisely because of the fact that he denied being so much more exceptional that he was prepared and able, thanks to that humility, to actually connect to God in a way that his specialness allowed. And that's what made him special. Because you're right, the average special can be rather arrogant. It's the special that is humble.
But that makes a lot of sense in today's terms, because here's a boy who's with his mother for 2 years, and then gets transferred to a completely different environment, rejected by the woman who wet nursed him, who we know his mother. He may not know that. All of a sudden he's with a different woman, and that might influence him, that he would never feel all that special,
right,
because he had been pushed away. Today's terms, we would see that as very logical.
Nowadays, psychologically, yes, we could say because he was wrenched from one family at 2 and then put with another and never really had a clear sense of his identity, because who knows what his Egyptian mother's treatment of him was like. Was he really accepted by the Egyptians? Was he not accepted? How did she explain him? You're right, he might have had some self-esteem issues from that. Maybe. I'm not entirely convinced, but maybe. No. You're right.
Because yet he still rises to the position of leadership.
Correct.
That's amazing.
But humility and self-esteem are not the same thing.
Correct.
You have to have strong self-esteem to be humble.
Exactly. You have to have strong self-awareness to be humble. Something our rabbis have said over and over again. That humility doesn't mean you say, I can't. Humility means you say, I am. And that you're honest in that statement. And if you are 15 cubits tall, you say it. But you don't say it as making yourself better than others. You just say it is. And that's what I am. So very, very true. All right, let's get back to that Egyptian mother, because she plays more of a role in this than perhaps we give her credit. I know she only pops in, gets the kid out of the water, and then she's gone 2 verses later. But let's see what our sages have done.
Okay. I assume by they mean the ladies in waiting to.
Exactly right. Thank you for the pronoun. Yes.
Yes. When they saw that she wanted to save Moses, they said to her, "Our mistress, it is customary in the world that when a mortal king makes a decree, even though everyone in the world may not carry it out, his sons and the members of his household carry it out."
I noticed the implicit statement that, yeah, I know some of us speed, but if your dad's the governor, you don't want to get caught speeding, because that's just bad. And it's, yeah. So what do you mean? That you can tell that there's a child out here in the river, or at least in the reeds of the river. This is not the kind of thing you in particular should be messing with, because your dad's king.
But you are going to violate the decree of your father. Gabriel came along and beat them into the ground.
Right. Well, and then this is based off Gabriel the angel, right? This is based off partly the awkwardness in the sentence of verse 5, where it says the daughter of Pharaoh came down to the bathe in the Nile, while her maidens walked along the Nile. Why this redundancy? Why didn't it just say the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile with her maidens? Why this extra of, along the Nile? And the idea is, well, because there along the Nile was the of being put into the bank by Gabriel for daring to tell her that she shouldn't save this kid.
And
Onward.
The proof is she sent Amatah.
No, this is not the proof.
Yes.
This is the next problem.
Oh, this is the next problem. She sent Amatah to get it.
All right. So what is Amatah? It's her Amah. But what does that mean?
What does the word Amah mean?
And what does the word Amah mean?
It's like a nurse, not a nurse,
okay.
a helper, a mother's helper.
A maidservant.
Thank you.
Exactly. And the classic English translation is maidservant, which is exactly what we get in the JPS translation. Let me just double check that. How she sent her slave girl. Sorry, they make it a little bit rougher. Exactly. So they send the slave girl to fetch it. That's what JPS says. But the problem is Amah, in later rabbinic Hebrew especially, has another meaning, which is a cubit. And what is a cubit?
Oh, this.
The distance from here to there, the arm. So did she send her servant or did she send her arm? You'll see. Keep reading.
Rabbi Judah and Rabbi Nehemiah said, one said she sent forth her hand. The other said she sent forth her servant girl.
So if you've ever seen a good midrash collection of illustrated stories for little kids, you will often see a picture of the daughter of Pharaoh standing on the bank of the Nile and her arms doing the Mr. Fantastic Reed Richards Plastic Man thing, stretching out to get the basket and bring it back to her. This is where it comes from, that she sent her arm. She sent her hand to go get it, and it just went catch and.
The one who said hand cites that which is written, her arm, amata.
Right, they read this to mean her ama, her cubit, and therefore that's what she sent.
Whereas the one who said serving girl, amata, points out that the word hand is not written.
We don't normally pick things up with our arms. We pick them up with our hands. It doesn't say she sent her hand. Even if you're going to read this to mean arm, it's still saying that she sent her arm, not her hand. So that doesn't seem to work. So these two rabbis are in conflict with each other.
However, but in the view of him who said that it was her serving girl,
which is perhaps a more natural reading of the text,
has it just now not been stated that Gabriel came and beat them into the ground?
But our earlier midrash said that Gabriel had smashed them all. So therefore, it must have been her own arms because her serving girls were smashed into the dirt. See how that works? What else? What did she have left to send? She didn't have her servants anymore because they were smashed.
Except he left her one, since it is not appropriate that a princess should stand all by herself.
Even Gabriel wouldn't smash all of them. Because how dare you leave a princess unattended? Because that's just not a princess anymore.
Hence, at the opening of the narrative, we find maidens attending her. But when she rescued the child, she sent her maiden, not maidens.
All right, that's a little insert there from Exodus Rabbah. It's not actually in this section from Sota. I brought it in to highlight what the rabbis had also noticed, which is the fact that when she sends to get the kid, she sends a singular of whatever it is she's sending. And the idea here is that, well, why is she only sending a singular? Because all the others but one have been smashed into the ground. You following the logic here?
That's close reading.
It's close reading. That's what we do.
Yes. According to the one who said her hand, should not the scripture have written, therefore, her hand?
If you're going to say hand, if you're going to claim that she sent her hand, it would be nice if the text said hand, right? A yad rather than ama.
But in this way, we are informed that her arm was lengthened.
She sent her hand, yes, because her arm stretched. Her hand didn't stretch, her arm stretched. Right? Not like she had long fingers. She just had a long arm. These guys love to argue. Okay, but what are they arguing about?
Exactly.
What are they arguing about?
Whether she herself took the baby or she said
Who
so.
got the baby?
Whether
cares?
Who cares? Because what does it mean for when we think about our own performance of doing a mitzvah?
Do it yourself.
Can you send someone to do it?
Right? Did we send someone else or do we do it yourself? And if you do it yourself, what about those things you think that are out of your reach? Right? If you want to do the mitzvah, you will stretch and be able to do so.
Well, even monkeys need to get a stick.
Even
Yeah.
monkeys need to get a stick or a servant girl, one or the other, right? So there's more to this debate than just the illustration of the children's version,
But
which is
it's also a mitzvah to ask somebody to help you in the mitzvah.
to ask.
And then it's only almost double that you got someone else involved.
Correct. If you can get someone else to perform a mitzvah with you or inspire more people to do the mitzvah, absolutely. But in a case like this, where you are seeing a foundling child, do you want someone else to do it or do you want to do it? And that's really what they're debating. And that's why it kind of bugs me when I see the illustrated versions. And they make it seem like that's the only thing that's being discussed here is the comic book stretching of her arms. Because what it's really trying to do is say, what kind of woman was she? Because that's the underlying debate. Was Bat Paro a good, kind, and merciful woman despite her father? And really wanted to stretch herself to save this child, because she couldn't save all of the kids, because she was just one person against her father's edicts. But this one that was right here where she could see it, this one she could save. Or was she really the daughter of her father? Was she a tyrant who was just curious about what was over there in the bushes and said, you, lackey, go get that? And that's what they're really wrestling with here. And we're going to continue to wrestle with that as we try to figure out why, when she opened up the basket, she had this reaction with, I remember our whole discussion of, I didn't write it on the board, the whole discussion of boy and lad and all of that. So onward.
Okay. Rabbi Judah said he was was a baby, but he had the voice of a youth, a na'ar.
Right? So why does it say that he is a na'ar when he's crying? Because even though he was only a baby, he had the voice of a young lad. His voice had broken.
It's like that thing.
Right? It didn't matter that he was 3 months old. He was already the baritone. Right?
Yes.
More, more. And that's what got her attention.
To which Rabbi Nehemiah replied, if so,
And by the way, that's Rashi's explanation in Rashi's commentary.
if so, you have portrayed Moses, our rabbi, as flawed.
How dare you say that he had a weird voice? Right? You're not allowed to be a Levitical singer if your voice is wonky. They find other jobs for you, but they're not going to put you in the choir if you're singing baritone when you're 3 months old. So Rabbi Nehemiah was very upset by Rabbi Yehuda's opinion because it made Moses a freak. And they did not want the idea of Moshe Rabbeinu to be portrayed as some oddball who just had this bizarrely deep voice at an early age.
So rather, it teaches his mother had made for him a youth's wedding canopy in the ark, saying, I may not have the merit of attending his wedding.
All right.
It's like talis shvalis. It's a chuppah.
Right, she's got a chuppah there, right? So she opens it up and she sees the baby and there's a little chuppah. Why would that matter for what Bat Paro does?
Right.
Think back to our discussion about what kind of woman is she? Is she being moved because he's crying in a bizarre way? Or is she being moved because she sees in the basket the symbol of the mother's desperate hope that she knows she's never going to see her child again?
Or else it's the mother's care of him to provide a sunshade.
Or the mother's care, but she sees this is a child that someone loves.
Mm.
Or does she see this as a child with a freakish voice?
Mm.
What kind of person does that make Bat Paro, make the daughter of Pharaoh? Is she the kind of person who's being moved because, wow, look, he's crying like there's something odd about this kid? Or does she see the kid and recognize a mother had to put this child in the river because of what my dad did? And was moved to compassion because of his na'arness, because she saw that the mother who put the child in the basket saw that this child may have no future. Did she realize that she now had an obligation to give the child a future? So again, they're not just doing fairy tales.
Rambam says, he cried as loudly as a boy.
All right, so Ramban, when he comments, it's much longer than this, but I'm trying to distill it because it's interest of time. He says, Rashi, going on with the whole voice of a youth, like the sound of the youth, that wasn't right. What the real thing was going on was he was as loud as an older child. And most of you that have had newborns know that for the first few months, they're not as loud as they get later. Right? And so that's really what Ramban is saying, is that he had already moved on to the upper level and that his crying was loud enough to elicit her sympathy. He wasn't just, but he was full on cry mode, more than you would expect from a 3-month-old. His lungs were working fine. And again, this is even more poignant if we take the other midrash the rabbis had that said that he was a premature child, because one of the biggest limitations for premature children is that the lungs are not fully developed.
Sforno said, she then saw that this was an exceptionally beautiful baby.
All right, so what was it that Sforno thought was stand out when she opened up the basket? Kitov. He's good. So why did she save him? He's a good-looking kid. Good-looking, beautiful children shouldn't be killed. Does that make her a great person? Does that make her a shallow person? Somewhere in between? Maybe somewhere in between, right? And Sforno goes on to point out that that's why the Kitov part came in the earlier verse, was so that we would understand why Pharaoh's daughter was saving him.
Maybe it was just opportunism. There it was, right at her doorstep. So
Yeah.
she wasn't out looking for it. It just seemed okay.
And the kid looked good.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
there it is.
it's not as though someone had gotten rid of this kid because they were deformed, because they were flawed, because they were ugly. This was a good kid. You know, why waste a nice kid? I'm sure. Please.
Technical question.
Yes.
So if Eitz Chaim is using the word beautiful for Kitov, is that because Sforno did?
It's because many people do, not just Sforno.
Okay.
Many people use the tov to mean physically of good appearance, which is actually kind of what Ibn Ezra is going to build off of in the next quote.
And Ibn Ezra said his limbs were formed like a boy's and thus more beautiful.
Why is he called a na'ar? Because he was already unfurled, unlike a fetus. You know, most newborns, I now know from personal experience, they're like this most of the time. And when you try to make them like this, they don't like it so much, right? They have to gently ease into that. But if he was already unfurled more, then he would look more like a baby, less like a newborn. And that is generally what we consider to be the pretty baby. You know, when you look in TV ads and the magazine ads for baby products, they don't show little newborns all curled up like this. They show the babies that have already allowed their limbs to extend. And Ibn Ezra says that's what that means by calling him a na'ar. He's already looking babyish rather than newbornish. And all of these, I should say.
All of the sages conclude that that's what moved her to compassion.
Right, they're each arguing about why is it that she felt pity? Why was it that she felt compassion at this point? And they're offering different explanations. Some are saying because they saw the signs of the mother that had put him in. Some are saying because he was just a good-looking kid. Some are saying because he cried in a special way. But they're all trying to figure out, why would she care about this kid and not the other thousands that were being killed by her father? And I think ultimately what they're all agreeing on is that when you stare into the face of the child that's being killed by your father's policies, this is the ultimate test of whether you're a good person or not. Can you stare into the face of a child that you know your father was once dead and say, oh, and then just drop it into the river? Or once you've seen the humanity of this what your father considers creature, are you now forced to try and do something to take care of it? And oftentimes for many of us, that is the turning point, when we see the humanity in some other person that we have either been having fights with or arguments with, or we just did not want to get along, or in the giant global geopolitical issues. It's often when we meet someone face to face that we begin to understand them and they begin to understand us better. And that's exactly what happens here with Pharaoh's daughter coming face to face with the hated, feared, male children of the Israelites who were going to take our country from us. No, it's just a kid. And they don't look evil, they look nice. All right, one last commentary on this.
She opened and saw. Anyone explaining the meaning of the line is that she saw the infant is an error.
All right, so Rashbam often cuts to the chase. He was much more of a Pashtan than his grandfather Rashi. He says, no, this is not, she opened it up and saw the boy. I know that's what it sounds like, but duh.
Who does not know that when someone would open the basket that he or she would see the infant?
Right. Who is surprised?
Yeah.
Lo and behold, there was a boy. Well, of course there was a boy. You told us a verse before that the boy was put in. It's not a surprise.
Right. Surely the Torah did not have to tell us something so elementary. Therefore, the meaning of the line is this. When she opened the basket and saw the infant and wanted to know if it was male or female, she found that the baby was male. When she also observed that he was circumcised, she realized that this baby had not been abandoned, but had been hidden in the reeds. If she would have found that the baby was a girl, it's possible it had just been abandoned. There is nothing unusual about an infant being called Na'ar, as we find Manoach asking the angel who had predicted the birth of Samson, what shall we do for the boy, Na'ar, once he will be born?
Okay, so I wanted to wrap up with Peshat, to make you understand that our sages know how to do Peshat when they want to do Peshat. It's not like our sages didn't understand the text well enough and came up with fairy tales because they were confused. Rashbam presents a perfectly reasonable explanation of all of this verse. She opened it up and she wanted to see if it was a boy and a girl. And she was not surprised there was a baby. She just wanted to know the gender. And she saw that it was a boy. And when she saw it was a boy, she saw that it had been circumcised. And when she saw that it had been circumcised and therefore a Hebrew child, she realized this wasn't just a child who had been abandoned, because there probably were lots of abandoned children in the ancient world, just as there were through most of human history. Illegitimate children from adulteries and other issues would have been abandoned all the time. That's why there used to be a lot of more orphanages. That's a very simple reading. And don't worry about the fact that it says Nar. From time to time, the Tanakh does use the word Nar to talk about infants. It may not be the most common usage of the word, but it's down there in the Webster's dictionary, the number 3, number 4 entry. So don't worry about it. But if we only had taken Rashbam's reading, if we'd started with Rashbam, we would never have asked ourselves about what makes a good person. What do we look for what someone will eventually be? What does it mean to be special? What does it mean to be Pharaoh's daughter? Are you moved by compassion, or are you just still callous? Or was she callous up until the point that she saw the child? Those are the questions the rabbis wanted us to ask, and gave their answers through all of the different midrashim. And they wanted us to ask those questions, not just to know about Moses' life, but to know about ourselves and to know about what was right and wrong in our own world. And hopefully we'll be willing to continue to ask those questions throughout the book of Exodus.
Fantastic.
Wow.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thank
Much glad you're back.
Absolutely.
Boy, did you come through a good one.
Yeah, really.
you. They're all